modified rap. I'm gonna I'm gonna call it right now. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to book club, everybody. Hi, I love you. Welcome. Um, it's our first official book club meeting. I'm very excited. Thank you for being here. This journey, it's been a journey. It's really only just started, but for some background, I sat down, I made a list of all of the book references that Taylor Swift has made throughout Tortured Poets, and it ended up being over 50 books. So now I'm on this journey to read all of the books for you because there's so many connections and so many beautiful things that we can learn about Taylor's music, but also just there's so many beautiful things about the authors and the writers and the artists that she highlights to learn. So we are here. Why we're reading it, just to level set, a couple of things. We started with this book because Taylor mentions it 3 different times, at least 3 different times. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something else that I'm missing. She mentions Patti Smith by name in the title track of the album. You're not Dylan Thomas, I'm not Patti Smith. She then says just kids in 2 different songs. In LOML, she says, stitching we were just kids, babe, which actually I think kind of comes up in this book. And then in Peter, she says, in closets like cedar, preserved from when we were just kids. And I was like, fuck, that's 3 times. We have to read this. And the way that I read it, the way that I went about it, is I listened to it on Audible and I read the physical copy because, I think we're all a bit of daydreamers. It's easy to miss. It's easy to miss some things. And Patti actually does narrate the entire book, which is great. But I went through and I highlighted literally anything that reminded me of Tortured Poets and Taylor Swift. And as you can tell, every time I turn to a page, there is something highlighted. It's all over it. What is my favorite song from TTPD? I Hate It Here. It's probably I Hate It Here. It's going to change every day, but I just said, I'm a daydreamer. I literally live life in my head. So there is a ton here. I've tried to structure this in a way that we can get through a lot. But to level set on what the book actually is for background in case you haven't seen it, haven't read it or seen anything about it. It's the memoir about Patti Smith. She moves to New York City and she meets beautiful Robert Mapplethorpe. And they basically become lovers and best friends in life and in art and throughout their careers. And it is their story. Mapplethorpe dies actually in the 80s from AIDS. And the day before he dies, he asks Patti to write their story. And this is the memoir that she created off of this. It's really, really beautiful. They were romantically involved for a pretty long time, but not always. They broke up, they got back together. And then eventually they kind of just started dating other people, and Robert started dating men. He died of AIDS in the 80s. And what I think is really beautiful, just in contrast to what we know about Taylor Swift's relationships, at least what we think we know, what she shows us, is we think that we know the very strict timelines of when she started dating X person and when they broke up and what songs are related to it. Whereas in here, it's much more fluid. It's when they were together versus when they were not romantically is not really a plot point throughout the story. It just kind of is. And whether that represents what actually happened versus it just not being the focus, I love it either way. But it really depicts how their lives have changed, how their careers grow over time, and just how much they truly know each other and see each other, which is so beautiful. We're going to go through 9 songs. Some of them will do deeper dives than others, but there are 9 songs that stand out throughout Tortured Poets that really show up here that we're going to deep dive into, and that's going to kind of be the structure of this. We have LOML, How Did It End? I Hate It Here, which, again, one of my favorites. Peter, which I thought was really interesting. I was not expecting that. But Daddy, I Love Him. The Alchemy, Down Bad, obviously the Tortured Poets department. And then we have a special Coney Island visit to do, because Coney Island plays a huge role in this. Amanda, if you want to read this book, these like aren't spoilers. I don't think that these are spoilers. I try not to go over books in a way that like makes it less fun for you to read them afterwards. So feel free to hang or get it on Audible. Okay, we're going to start with LOML, because I know, like, if you think about LOML, the song, it depicts like a romantic relationship not working out. And there's a lot of like clues about how it's like a lie. Reading it now, probably on my suggestion. The fact that people are reading because of me is like one of my biggest accomplishments in life. LOML depicts like a relationship where there are lies being told, right? A con man sells a fool, a get love quick scheme. And while that is like not what is baked into the relationship of Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe, I truly believe that Robert is the loss of Patti's life, 100%. She talks about, she never uses the word soulmate. I use the word soulmate when I'm describing them, but there are some like really incredible connections that these two have, and the way that like they talk about each other and know each other is really beautiful. Like she talks about how they're both artist and muse. And I think that that's something that Taylor probably like tries to emulate throughout, or is like maybe not emulating, but is maybe romanticizing for herself. Being able to have a partner that both inspires you and who you can inspire in return when it comes to art. In this quote, Patti says, "We chose to present a body of work that emphasized our relationship, artist and muse, a role that for both of us was interchangeable." They also talk about how they have this, what represents their relationship is this like little blue star that they would always draw, and Robert would write their names together and use the little blue star to like just denote it was the two of them. And she says that he was the blue star in the constellation of my personal cosmology. He was the artist of my life. Like the way that they talk about each other is so, like, I'm happily married and I have like very, very close best friends, and I'm like, does anybody know me in this way? Like, it's so beautiful. At its best, our friendship was a refuge from everything, where he could hide or coil like an exhausted baby snake. Shout out to Reputation. Another thing that really stood out to me is that they recognized each other's talents in a way that they didn't even know of themselves. Like all throughout the book, like Robert he would make a lot of collages, and he would cut out pictures from like magazines and stuff like that, make these collages, and Patti would always encourage him to make his own pictures, like take your own pictures. They don't understand why you're not taking your own pictures. And then he finally goes on to like become the most successful in photography out of all of his art. And the other way is true too, where Robert tells Patti constantly, like, I want the world to hear you. I want everyone to hear you. And she's like, you're hearing me. That's enough for me. And he's like, no, the world needs to hear you. And she goes on to make 12 albums for the world to hear. And it's like they knew each other's talent before they even truly knew what they were even going to do. So when I think about like Taylor, especially, I don't love to think about Maddie, but we have to think about Maddie sometimes, in a way that she like might romanticize things in her head. Like, are the artists that are reading this and idolizing this book and idolizing the relationship that they have maybe missing some judgment, some judgment calls when it comes to trying to find a partner to actually do this with? I know Taylor's with a football player, which probably is a lot easier than dating like a deep artist at the same time. And even though, just like wrapping up Loss of My Life, LOML, even though they didn't end up together, right? Patti marries another man. She has kids with that man. Robert has a relationship with this guy named Sam for a very long time. But when Robert is dying, he looks at Patti and he says, "We never had kids." And I think that's really interesting because at the time that he says this, Patti has 2 children. So he's not saying neither of us had kids to like continue our legacy. He's saying you and me, we never had kids. And there's like this other time too where they get high together and Robert's like, hey, do you want to sleep together? And they're like, not, their relationship is so far gone at this point, romantically. And then he like realizes the impact that it has on her and he apologizes. And so I think that there is still this like underlying love that is kind of romantic, even though they did part ways and understand that romantically they were never going to be together in the long term. LOML, like that feeling of heartbreak and desperation that you hear in that song is like very much the same energy that you get in this book. We have to talk about how did it end. I don't want to get too far into it because we have to. It's really sad. It's very, very sad. The foreword of the book, if we think about the bridge. Say it once again with feeling how the death-rattled breathing silenced as the soul was leaving. That comes up a lot. The foreword of the actual book, the second sentence, I held the receiver and listened to his labored breath through the phone. She continues to describe it towards the end of his life, where she talks about his labored breath. She also talks about like the silence that comes along with it. Silenced as the soul was leaving. It makes me think that like this has to have inspired it. The light poured through the windows upon his photographs and the poem of us sitting together a last time. Robert dying, creating silence. Devastating. When I heard him for the last time, breathing with such force that it obscured the voice of his brother on the phone. There's not a lot that makes me cry. I was leaking heavily when I was reading this. There's just no doubt in my mind that like the pain of him dying is the bridge of how did it end. Not a doubt in my mind. Okay. Let's move on to something lighter, shall we? Everyone, let's take a sip of coffee and just gather ourselves. What's the book? The book is Just Kids by Patti Smith. You're not Dylan Thomas. I'm not Patti Smith. Stitching, we were just kids, babe. That's what Taylor is referencing. Welcome to book club. If you are not already following me, please do. I'm going to read like 50 books and tell you all about them. Specifically how they're related to torture poets. Everything is more fun through the lens of Taylor Swift. Allison, thank you. Allison 13. Gotta love a 13. Okay, moving on to something lighter. Let's talk about Patti's childhood. Patti and Taylor were actually very similar as children. Patti talks about how she vexed her teachers with her precocious reading ability. Where have we heard the word precocious? We hear it in I Hate It Here. In this same like page where Patti's talking about this, she talks about how she reads as a form of escape. I vexed my teachers with my precocious reading ability paired with the inability to apply it to anything they deemed practical. One by one, they noted in my reports that I daydreamed far too much. Was always somewhere else. Relatable. Happy Libra season, everyone. I'm a Libra, and I live inside of my mind. I'll save all my romanticism for my inner life, which also makes me think of, like, our artists like Taylor going after a relationship like this where there can be both artist and muse. Are they romanticizing that too much to where they are making poor judgment calls as a way to carry that out? It makes me think of folklore. Like, from the first time I listened to folklore, I was like, these aren't fake stories. These are the stories that someone's telling themselves, but they're very much living in that world. I'll save all my romanticism for my inner life. She read books as a form of escape. Also, shout out, she lived in Pennsylvania for a period of time, which was like an hour from Reading, Pennsylvania, where Taylor grew up, before moving to Jersey and then ultimately New York. But still, notable. Patti describes herself as being one of the clan of Peter Pan. That rhyme gets me every time. Peter, the song Peter, and the concept of Peter Pan and Peter Pan syndrome showed up way more than I was anticipating it to. I know I have a couple of videos on this already, but it's worth going through, at least highlighting it. I'll also say we have not read Peter Pan yet, so I know that there is so much more to learn when it comes to the actual story of Peter Pan. And the book itself, because I do think the book is different than the movie. Not that I'm familiar with the movie either. It's just like not one of those ones that I watched growing up. There are 4 different times that Patti mentions Peter Pan. The first is when she's describing her childhood. It's actually kind of like a sad saga. She says that she is one of the clan of Peter Pan and never wanted to grow up. And a few pages later, she talks about how at 19, she got pregnant. And it forced her to grow up. The irony that I, who never wanted to be a girl nor grow up, would be faced with this child did not escape me. I was humbled by nature. The boy, who was only 17, was so inexperienced that he could hardly be held accountable. I would have to take care of things on my own. And some of the things that I talk about in some of the videos that I have made is like this luxury that men have with being able to maintain their Peter Pan syndrome into adulthood that women just like generally are not afforded. And this is like kind of an extreme example, but it is a good one. Patti ultimately does have the baby and finds a family to adopt it. And it forces her to grow up. She never even tells the father that she was pregnant, right? She, in that moment, affords him the ability to continue his life in whatever way that he wants it, and she is the one that has to deal with their circumstances. Later on in life, when she is living in New York City, she is describing her life living with Robert, and she describes it. She describes her friends being over, and she says, I would show my drawings and tell stories about them like Wendy entertaining the lost children. So she starts off as one of the lost boys of Peter Pan, and because of life, patriarchal society, etc., turns into Wendy, unwillingly, but turns into Wendy and ends up with responsibility. And one of the other things that I think is really interesting is as she is living with Robert, she allows him to quit his job, and she is the only one making an income. And these are starving artists, okay? Like literally, they are like barely able to make rent payments, very often are not able to eat. There are a number of anecdotes that she tells where they are stealing food to eat, literally starving artists. And because Robert, his creative process was too confined by needing to keep a job and holding hours, and she saw kind of how it dampened his creative process, she told him to quit his job and that she would just take care of the bills, which I find really interesting because, again, it's like something that she is sacrificing of herself in order to care for somebody else, in order to allow somebody else their Peter Pan syndrome, their ability to do what they want in life, even though she as an artist is still trying to accomplish the same thing. And she says, I had no regrets taking on the job as breadwinner. My temperament was sturdier. Temperament. Kamala for president. I could still create at night, and I was proud to provide a situation allowing him to do his work without compromise. She clearly feels fine about it. I just feel upset for her. I don't know. I love the descriptions of their first apartment. The outlook that they have on creating something of their own in what small space they have is really beautiful. Like, it does make you think of, like, what are the true necessities in life and what does it mean to be free, which we will talk about, because for them that is freedom, just like having the ability to create art despite their sometimes not having a place to live or even being able to eat. Okay, the last time that Peter Pan shows up, we're kind of so run out of time, that's okay. Not everything is this deep of a dive, but the last time that Peter Pan shows up is actually talking about this man that was like in love with Robert, and he was kind of chasing him around, just obsessed with him, and Robert didn't really feel the same way. She talks about him like chasing Peter Pan's shadow, which I find really funny. In Peter Pan, one of the lost boys is named John. This guy's name was John. He was in love with Robert. Sometimes he seemed so to me a pale and wispy Victorian boy, ever chasing after Pan's shadow, which in this context is kind of cute and funny. But then again, if we think back to the actual song, Peter and loml and whatever or whoever Taylor is chasing in those songs, like, she is chasing Pan's shadow. Oh, but Daddy, I love him. Growing up precocious sometimes means never growing up at all. Religion plays a pretty big role. In this book. I don't actually have my head totally wrapped around it yet, so I'll try to get you through what I do know and do think, but sometimes you have to sit with things for like a year before you fully process it. Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe both grew up in religious households. Robert way more than Patti. His parents were like devout Catholics. And both of them in their adulthood tried to like separate themselves from religion. Robert did so in like a very extreme way. And it's funny, Patti says that as he was dying, he tried every single thing to survive except for praying. He did not want to rely on religion for anything. He wanted to separate himself from that. But it's really interesting because there's so much of religion that still shows up in his actual art that he creates. It's not something that he's able to like escape from. Patti says that she, for a long time, only loved the aesthetic of religion, and as a child she like loved the idea of there being this like bigger presence above them, but felt a lot of pressure to be perfect and to always be good, and felt like that wasn't something that she was like really able to attain. And that really reminds me of like that monologue that Taylor does in Miss Americana, where she talks about how her whole like structure of her life was just her trying to figure out like how to be good. And I think like as women, that's something that's also really relatable, even just outside of religion. But they really push back against religion quite a bit. There's a song that Patti writes where she says, "Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine," which I find really interesting. Robert goes on to describe himself as evil. He actually really leans into the idea of magic as opposed to religion. Like, he actually reads a bunch of books about those who tried to like find success with alchemy, which we also see in Tortured Poets, right? We see Taylor talking about religion and But Daddy, I Love Him and Guilty as Sin, but then we also see her leaning into concepts of alchemy and the prophecy and magic. It's like very mirrored. But Daddy, I Love Him, I think sticks out to me in particular because like the message that Taylor is saying is that she wants control over her public image, right? She's not allowed to make decisions for herself, but the way that she delivers that message is with the language of religion and like specifically the harm that it has on women's lives. But even though all these artists are pushing back against religion, it's like they can never really escape it. And that also reminds me of what is the song from Lover? Soon You'll Get Better. Desperate people find faith, so now I pray to Jesus too. Like, kind of insinuates that she took a step back, but is like, what else are you going to do in these times of desperation? There are a lot of quotes about magic in here too. the quote that is even before the foreword in the book at all is really interesting. Much has been said about Robert, and more will be added. Young men will adapt his gait, young girls will wear white dresses and mourn his curls. He will be condemned and adored, his excesses damned or romanticized. In the end, truth will be found in his work, the corporeal body of the artist. It will not fall away. Man cannot judge it. For art sings of God and ultimately belongs to him. But the him is lowercase in that sentence. And I feel like I'm going to be thinking about this for the rest of my life. For art sings of God and ultimately belongs to him. Is she saying it belongs to God, or is she saying it belongs to Robert? One may never know. Unless Patti Smith joins us on this live and tells us. Someone wants to tag her in. Is she on TikTok? I know she's on Instagram. I don't know if she's on TikTok. We would talk about the word magic. Robert would often use it to describe us about a successful poem or drawing. They actually talk about alchemy quite a bit, which we can go into. They talk about it as like the creation of work, alchemy. So if we think of Taylor's song, like, who are we to fight the alchemy? I won't spend too much time on this either, because if you are not, if you're new here, I have about 8 or so videos about the alchemy. I feel very strongly about it. That it's not like a love song about Travis. It exists because of Travis and football. It may be inspired by Travis and football, but is about her career, the success that she has in her career. Robert and Patti talk about alchemy constantly throughout this book. And when it's not related to just Robert trying to figure out how magic works, which is relatable, they talk about it as their creation of art, their transformation of art, how Robert would take raw materials from anywhere and anything and create art out of it. We talked about like cutting out pictures, cutting out magazines. One of my favorite anecdotes was that they would hang around at this bar called Max's, and they would wait for people to be done eating, and then they would go steal the lobster claws, and Robert would use those lobster claws in his pieces of art, like truly finding anything and turning it into art. And what that brought me to is like, well, then is the alchemy by Taylor Swift about her relationship, or is it actually about her creation of art and like the relationship that she has with her audience? And I think you probably know where I fall when it comes to that. Long story short, in case you are new here, long story short, when it comes to the alchemy, I believe that it is Taylor's response to all of the people that were mad at her for being shown during the NFL games. Because when you look at someone like Travis Kelce or any successful football player, they are immediately given respect. They are immediately praised for their hard work. But when she goes into that same arena, literally in those football stadiums, she has to earn respect. It takes so much more work, and very often she just doesn't get it. And so the alchemy is her explaining the success of her career using football terms, which are generally immediately accepted and not questioned by the public. I'm really talking about men, but there are women that are mad about her 25 seconds of screen time on Sundays. That being said, happy Sunday, everybody. Happy football Sunday. I don't know if the Chiefs are playing today. I don't know if Taylor will be there today, but I love me a Taylor Swift football game outfit. I love to see what she's wearing. Also, again, just in case you weren't here in the 5 minutes leading up to this live, I have no idea how to hold this coffee cup. I'm at my sister's house. I don't know what this is. If anyone knows how to hold this, this is the best I got, but I have to like actively think about it. Okay, we're in down bad territory. We're doing good on time. Down Bad, God, one of my favorite songs. Patti talks about aliens a lot. Patti talks about aliens a lot. We won't spend too much time here, but I do think that the Torture Poets Department, that LOML, that Peter, and Down Bad are all talking about the same person or thing. I know that we can tie these songs to muses. I know that we can tie them to other things as well. But whatever it is, I think it's all representing the same thing. She's talking to the same entity. Something that's really interesting is that in Electric Lady Studios, where both Taylor and Patti have recorded albums. Patti was actually at the opening of Electric Lady Studios back in, 1970? Apparently Electric Lady Studios has aliens, like, all over the walls. And of course it's going to take me too long to find it. Okay. Patti's recording an album. She says, "We got our take exactly at midnight." Just meet me at midnight. "Robert and I stood in front of one of the space alien murals that lined the hall of Electric Lady Studios." Do yourself a favor a little bit later, because don't leave my live. But Google the alien murals in Electric Lady Studios. They're pretty cool. I might make it my background, my phone background or my computer background or something. But you can't tell me that, like, alien references did not inspire Taylor in recording Down Bad. You cannot tell me. She makes a ton of references as to, like, feeling like an alien, not just, like, being alienated and isolated from, like, the rest of society, because, like, I think a lot of artists probably feel that way. But she literally uses, like, we are aliens. We only know each other. We're kin to each other, and that we are both aliens. She also, page 80, hold on. In talking about Robert, what leads up to this? Where does it all lead? What will become of us? These were our young questions, and young answers were revealed. It leads to each other. We become ourselves. For a time, Robert protected me, then was dependent on me. Yada, yada, yada. In talking about Robert, she says, "Robert responded as my beloved twin." My twin. Like I lost my twin. Waving at the ship. Just saying. Just saying. Okay. You're not Dylan Thomas. I'm not Patti Smith. This has kind of been haunting me. Obviously, we're reading the book because of this line. You're not Dylan Thomas. I'm not Patti Smith. And I know, like I lost my twin. We should have a moment of silence for that. It is pretty sad. Moment of silence for like I lost my twin. Weirdly enough, the title track of Tortured Poets Department, I didn't find that many connections throughout Just Kids, outside of like the main things that we already talked about. I'm not Patti Smith, saying Just Kids in multiple songs. There are a couple of things, I don't know if it feels like a reach, but it's like the lines like, who else decodes you? Who's gonna know you like me? Like, we talked about how intimately the two of these individuals actually know each other and see each other. Like, that does feel like it feels very Robert and Patti. Jordan Daly, welcome. Thank you for the rose. I know I can always count on you, my biggest supporters. There was another thing that stood out to me, though. At the end of Tortured Poets, the title track, there's the line, you took my ring off my middle finger and put it on the one people put wedding rings on. And remember, Robert grew up very Catholic. You need to deep dive into the 1975 music. Part of the problem, I'm sorry, I need to stay focused, but part of the problem of like deep diving into anything related to Taylor Swift is that the rabbit holes go so far, and that sometimes it's just like more than we've signed up for. I'm afraid to touch the 1975 music. I probably will at a point. We have the rest of our lives to do this. Okay. They read this together. Oh God. Okay. All right. Okay. You've convinced me. So please send me some information on what exactly I need to listen to. I would appreciate that. There are only 2 albums. That's a lot. It's a lot for someone that only listens to Taylor Swift. You take my ring off my middle finger and put it on the one people put wedding rings on. When Robert introduces Patti to his family, because they're living together, he tells his parents that they're married because it would be a sin to live together otherwise. And when his mom is like, why aren't you wearing a ring? Patti's like, well, we didn't have enough money for one. She just lies. And so his mom goes and gets a ring and puts it in her hand and says, you should wear this on your left ring finger. And it's like, right, it's this fake marriage. And again, I know it all seems okay. Like, I can't tell you how many people were in my comments when I first started posting about this book saying that, like, they were just friends. He was gay. He actually didn't like titles. He didn't label himself anything. And I do think that he is the loss of her life. I'm sorry. 2 fake marriages, 2 fake rings. It's not a coincidence. Our first kiss was in a Walmart toy department. We don't have money, babe, but I have the ring. Ugh. Reminds me of Teen Mom. Are you guys old enough to remember Teen Mom? When Amber's fiance at the time, her baby daddy, gets the ring from Walmart. God, what a good show. All right, let's talk about Coney Island. I know Coney Island is not on Tortured Poets, but we're going to veer a little bit off of Tortured Poets for a couple minutes because there's too many other connections. Coney Island plays a huge role in Just Kids. It is Patti and Robert's escape. Patti talks about how, like, enamored she is that the beach is just a subway right away. Personally, I had a really hard time when 1989 was, like, rebranded from a city album to a beach album with Taylor's version. But it is, right? There's the acknowledgement of the beach. Patti and Robert would go to Coney Island, and every time they would write their names in the sand, and I can only think about, like, Carly Loves Taylor, written in the sand, 1989, written in the sand. They would go to see the freak shows on Coney Island, which don't exist anymore. But I think there is almost, like, this sense of belonging of, like they saw it as art and, like, maybe not feeling so freakish themselves. I'm projecting a little, but that's what I'm, taking from it. And Coney Island in this book, like, really represents escape, which we already talked about. I hate it here. Saving romanticism for our inner lives. It represents, like, this nostalgia. She thinks back to Coney Island as, like, their happy times, like, regardless of what was going on in their life, like, they were able to escape to that. And when you think about the actual song Coney Island from Taylor Swift, there's some of that same sad nostalgia. Like, she talks about, like, the arcade at the mall, gift wrap suburban dreams. The Coney Island song is a little bit more of, like, how she kind of fucked it up and neglected it. And maybe there's some of that in Just Kids of, like, just wishing you could go back and maybe pausing the moment and enjoying it. but it's really kind of sad. Outside of like the arcade and like I'm literally sitting on a bench in Coney Island wondering where you went. The loss of my life. Where are you? I wasn't able to find too many other like specific lyrics that stood out. But just like the concept of Coney Island. Also, I've never been to Coney Island. Or Cornelia Street. I'm only 3 hours from New York City. I go multiple times a year. I think maybe we need to do like a Taylor Swift themed visit to New York City. I'm sure I wouldn't be the first. Road trip, train trip. Yeah, train trip. Let's go to Coney Island. It also makes me wonder, like Patti Smith talks about, obviously, the Chelsea Hotel for like 100 pages in this, and it's just like full of artists, like very famous artists that they were able to collaborate with, be inspired by. And it makes me wonder if Taylor's gone and stayed at the Chelsea Hotel. Granted, she talks about how it also has changed over time and isn't quite the same. So maybe not. But like, what themed trips and field trips has Taylor gone on in search of her own inspiration? Okay, we have to talk about 1989. I have yet to talk about any of this on TikTok. I will make a video because I find it really interesting. Obviously, we're reading Just Kids because of the connections to tortured poets. But I started thinking about 1989 because obviously that is like the New York City album. And I was like, could there be connections here? And like, of course there are. So like, first and foremost, which is pretty obvious, like Just Kids and 1989 are both about artists moving to New York City, creating their art, their lives in their social circles. Great. Taylor Swift and Patti Smith both record albums at Electric Lady Studios. Patti Smith is actually at the opening of Electric Lady Studios. It blows my mind. I know she officiated the wedding there recently of the current owners too, where Taylor also attended. But I hadn't thought too much about the connections between Taylor and Robert Mapplethorpe until I started thinking about 1989. And there's actually quite a bit. First of all, Robert made a lot of different art, but was ultimately most famous for his photography. His favorite type of photography, Polaroids. The very first exhibit that he did was called Polaroids, which is obviously like not just the original album of 1989, but all of the special edition CDs that you could buy had like a subset of Polaroids depicting Taylor just like living life in New York City, which was, yes, part of his art, but also just part of what he captured in his life, like living with Patti Smith. Like, there are a lot of pictures in this book, and they are just his Polaroids from the time that they lived together. And of course, I'm like pretty much everything in here was Polaroid. Most of the cameras that he used were Polaroids. There's actually a picture of his Polaroid camera in here. So that's the first weird thing. Second weird thing. When he dies, Patti describes his memorial service, which they had by the water, and it was surrounded by gulls, like seagulls. She describes his memorial service as just a flock of seagulls swirling around them. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. I think we have to talk about Robert's sexuality and I guess the fluidity of that as well. Gaylor or not, you can't deny like any of the queer flagging that Taylor has done in all of her work. And as I said before, like Robert dated both men and women in his lifetime. He refused to be labeled. He didn't like connect with any of the labels that I guess existed at the time. And it's not really even like a plot point in the book. It just kind of like exists. And literally the very first song of 1989, Welcome to New York, You Can Want Who You Want, Boys and Boys and Girls and Girls. Also, okay, yes, thank you. Let's talk about, he dies in 1989, okay? In 1989, New York loses a prolific New York artist, and another that is going to have a huge impact on the art scene is born. The best people in life are free and New Romantics. So when Patti moves to New York City, she, I don't need to find this, I can just tell you about it. She's homeless for like a period of time, and she meets other like unhoused people who kind of show her the ropes and like where to find resources and et cetera, et cetera. And they talk about how free they are. She talks about how hungry they are, but how free they are. Like, all they want to do is to be able to create art, period. That's it. And in the moments where she was hungry, didn't know where she was going to sleep, didn't know how she was going to get a job, the mantra for herself is, I am free, I am free, I am free. The best people in life are free. I don't know. It could be all coincidence, but there's enough to at least think about. Okay, a couple more things and we're going to wrap up. So there is a number of other really weird connections that are not enough to do a monologue on. But here's just a couple more, okay? Patti Smith's most successful album is titled Easter. It made it to number 13 on the top 40. Many of the songs that Patti writes start off as poems and she turns them into songs. I am dying to know what songs of Taylor's started as poems. I'm convinced that there's at least one. It's got to be at least one. She talks about wondering how other poets would approach performing rock and roll. Patti loves numerology. She doesn't say it explicitly, but a lot of the big events that happen in her life, the times where she chooses to go live in Paris a month, the times where she chooses to move from house to house, into the Chelsea, out of the Chelsea, leaving Robert, etc., it is always tied to, well, it was on the day of a full moon, it was on the day of Rimbaud's birthday, it was on the day of my mother's birthday, it was during the month of Rimbaud's birthday. Everything is tied to some significant event, just like Taylor. The cover of a cover. Okay, I found this really interesting because so many people pointed out how the cover of this book and the cover of the anthology are like very reminiscent of each other. And in one of the works of poetry that Patti creates, Robert, of course, like filmed everything. He took all the photography. She wanted to make a cover of a Bob Dylan album. She loved Bob Dylan, obsessed with Bob Dylan. And she wanted to do a cover of one of his covers. And is this not a cover of a cover? Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. Patti uses the word labyrinth approximately 15 times in this book. And there's like this short section where she says it a ton, talking about like works of art, people's minds, and like basically within the same breath she says that she hates elevators. Okay. There's a snow on the beach reference. She says that the Chelsea was like a doll's house. We have the Lover House that looks like a doll's house. I love the snow on the beach reference. And then I have one more and we'll move on. We stood at the window and looked out at the snow falling beyond the fluorescent oasis sign with its squiggly palm tree. Look, he said, it's snowing in the desert. I don't know. Okay, lastly, the first room that they lived in the Chelsea Hotel is room 1017. And she describes it as an inhospitable prison with a white metal frame bed. Just what does that remind you of? An inhospitable prison, fresh out the slammer, with a white metal frame bed, which is exactly what is in the Fortnite music video and the Eras tour. I digress. Okay. When I put together, we're going to go through like kind of the main themes. I'm going to rate all of the books that I read through Tortured Poets on this scale. There are 4 main things that show up in the 50 plus books. The dogs are barking. Common themes that show up in the 50 plus books that are referenced in Tortured Poets. One is women's stories. They are usually either like the writer themselves or about the story itself. A lot of times they're like feminist ideas, especially during times where like feminism was not accepted. So I think Just Kids, obviously, like, it is a woman's story because Patti is a woman and she's writing the story. It is her memoir, after all. There are some like subtle feminist hints, right? We've talked about the Peter Pan thing. We've talked about how she needed to deal with her pregnancy at 19 and growing up really quickly, but there isn't a lot of highlighting the differences in genders in New York as it relates to their career, or the differences between Patti and Robert. So I'll give it a 4 out of 5 as far as that. It does track. It's on the scale, for sure. For sure. Can't deny that it's there. The next is New York versus London, which, like, not surprising, like, Tortured Poets, track 5 is So Long London, right? We understand the significance there is between Taylor's life in New York, her move to London, her move out of London. We get it. All 50 books represent either New York or London. I may exaggerate to make a point, but you get it. The majority of them. This is a 5 out of 5 New York, obviously. Like, 5 out of 5 Empire State Buildings, 5 out of 5 Chelsea hotels, 0 out of 5 Big Bens. London is not mentioned at all, but that's okay. It is a 5 out of 5 New York. Done on purpose. High Society. Again, I'm kind of surprised and not surprised that a lot of these books talk about the pressures of like high society, of like being in these like upper crust circles, of having to like maintain a certain behavior and image in order to like fit in with these people. And the New York City art scene was very much like a circle, just like any celebrity circle is. And I will read to you because Robert started like making friends in these circles. He had to. He needed money to create his art. I felt increasingly out of place in Robert's social whirl. He escorted me to teas, dinners, and an occasional party. We sat at tables where a single setting had more forks and spoons than needed for a family of 5. I could never understand why we had to separate at dinner or why I had to engage in discussions with people that I don't know. He was beginning to penetrate higher society, but to stay in step with him socially, I would have needed to change my ways. And she doesn't. She doesn't change her ways. The first time she was offered a record label or a record deal from a label, she turned it down. She's like, nah, that's not really for me. I felt instantly confined by the notion that we are born into a world where everything was mapped out by those before us. I struggled to suppress destructive impulses and worked instead on creative ones. There are so many of these books that talk about like the confines of these social circles, the isolation that they feel, a lot of the drugs that are being done, a lot of times as a way of like a coping mechanism, that it makes me like really wonder what Taylor feels about these same types of circles. Actually, I feel like I understand how she feels about them because she wouldn't be highlighting their issues if she wouldn't be highlighting their issues if she didn't feel that way about them. I feel pretty confident in that. It's just not something, I just feel like it's not something we've seen really highlighted too much in her music. Like, you get pieces of it, right? In But Daddy, I Love Him, she pushes back against the image that she needs to maintain, how she's not able to make decisions for herself, but it's not necessarily like what's happening behind the scenes at these parties. Maybe we'll get that in a future album, especially because, like, she's back in the public eye now, right? She has been for the last, like, year. All those things with, like, yeah, champagne problems. All of the Brittany Mahomes stuff. I don't know. I hope we get more of it. There's a ton of that in Valley of the Dolls. So I read Valley of the Dolls months ago. I have a couple of videos about it. It's like themes and messages that, like, maybe go back and watch those because it's really interesting, which is very much like what is the celebrity scene in New York City. Okay, fourth thing on the scale. Oh, that was, so I gave it like a 2.5 out of 5. Because it's mentioned, but it's not really explored. I think that's my problem with some of these. It's mentioned, but not explored. And then mental health is like the fourth thing that comes up over and over and over again in like these 50 plus books. It's mentioned. Like, Patti talks a lot about their friends who have died over time, a number of them by suicide. They were part of the circle of, like, the 27 Club with, like, Jimi Hendrix dying. I think of pills. Janis Joplin had a heroin overdose. Brian Jones mysteriously drowned in his pool. All at the age of 27. Those were all of their friends. And so it definitely comes up. I think a number of those, like, societal pressures to be successful as well probably drives people to struggle with mental health. That leads them to coping mechanisms. It leads them to things like suicide. But it's more, it's not really explored, but it is mentioned. So again, I don't know, 3 out of 5. It's on the scale for every single one of them. Jim Morrison, yes, thank you. Jim Morrison was the other one. She goes to visit his grave in the book as well, which is like a really interesting anecdote. Okay, we have 2 minutes left in like what's been scheduled here. We can hang out as long as you want, but I will probably keep making videos about Just Kids. I'm going to not be able to stop thinking about it, but we are moving into a new month, which means that we have to move into a new book. I think we'll do books monthly. It seems to make sense. I can be a slow reader sometimes too, so if I'm reading the books for you, I'm going to need a little bit of grace. We had a few different book options for October. I had a full 3 people vote, and I have to take those votes seriously. Restricted and does not comply with the For You feed. TikTok is limiting me. I don't know why. I don't know if we're going to get cut off at 11:30 too, but if so, if you haven't already followed me, please follow me. I love doing this. I love that we have 40 plus of you here. This is incredible. Slow reading is great. Thank you. Okay, perfect. We're all at the same pace. We are going to be reading The Shining. I should have brought it over so I can hold it up for you, but it's across the room. We're going to be reading The Shining for October, and I got to be honest, I don't know just how much we are going to find connected to tortured poets, probably more than we think. Taylor Swift is everywhere. It's the lens that I see the world. There are quite a bit. Like, The Shining, we have a madman typing away on a typewriter, all work and no play, makes Jack a dull boy. Okay, there may be a My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys reference in there that we don't know about. He's seeing visions. Is he mad or bad or wise? We have falling back into the hedge maze. What a way to die. The book is also different from the movie, so we are going to honor the book. Stephen King, by the way, hates the movie, hates the movie adaptation. We'll talk a lot about that. And as far as women's stories too, the woman that plays, oh my God, I'm going to blank on her name right now, but the woman that plays the wife in The Shining, was just like horribly mistreated by Hollywood. The world owes her a huge fucking apology. Like, she's up there with the rank. Shelley Duvall, she's up there with the ranks of like the Monica Lewinskys of the world. Like, they did her a complete fucking injustice. So that'll be a fun one. It's so dark. That'll be a fun one to explore. God. But yeah, happy October, happy Halloween. We could also watch the movie. Also, we might do a little movie excursion on one weekend to watch Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because Down Bad is basically Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was novelized after the movie came out, but doesn't have very good reviews, and it was written by Steven Spielberg, who I'm guessing directed the movie. But it was a movie first, so we might do a little bit of book club cheating and watch Close Encounters of the Third Kind one weekend, like, just for fun, because why not? Okay, that was a lot in an hour. Thank you all for being here. I love every single one of you. Love the live, thank you. Thank you, Judy Dugan 1. Thank you, Mama G, for being here. Yes, please follow me if you haven't. There will be more Just Kids coming, but I'll start reading The Shining today. I have read it before, and it's honestly one of my favorite Stephen King books. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, happy Sunday, everyone. Let's keep an eye out for what Taylor is wearing today. Hopefully she shows up.